today, again, we're covering social psych, our last new stuff. And the social psych unit focuses on our nature as animals, how we interact with each other, engagement, comfort, love, conflict, all of those kinds of things. Stereotypes, prejudices, all that's covered in this unit. And so today specifically, we are focusing on group dynamics, aggression, and keys to cooperation. And then we'll have a couple review questions and a practice FRQ at the end. All right, so first topic in the session tonight is group influence, and specifically this term called social facilitation. And what social facilitation says that in some cases, our performance is stronger in the presence of others, meaning I do better at certain tasks when other people are watching me. And so the caveat to this, me being better, me being more successful, is that it has to be a well-learned task. So if you look at the image here, when I'm learning how to juggle, if I'm learning how to juggle in front of a group of people, I'm probably not going to be successful because it's going to make me more nervous and more likely to fail. However, if I'm a accomplished juggler, someone who's practiced this for a long time, I will actually see a significant or a moderate increase in my abilities doing it in front of a friendly crowd. I will do better. So basically, social facilitation is the strengthening of the most likely response. If I'm about to pick up some balls and juggle, and I've never juggled before, then social facilitation is going to strengthen the response of me not doing well at juggling. But again, if this is something I've practiced over and over, then I'm more likely to be successful at that. So basically, what I do well, or what I do good at, that's bad grammar, sorry, what you do well at, you do better in front of an audience, especially a friendly one. So specifically home field advantage, right? That's a real thing. They've analyzed like sporting events and games, and the home crowd does tend to come out on top more often than the away team. And so there is a slight edge or a slight boost having that home field advantage. It facilitates your performance and it makes you do better. So that would be social facilitation. So be careful though with that on the test, because sometimes they'll ask you about something like, oh, if you're a novice pianist, you're a novice piano player, then you're not going to do better. It's the strengthening of the most likely response. So whatever you're most likely to do, that's going to get stronger with social facilitation. All right. Another group dynamic is this idea of social loafing. And I bet we all have experienced this at some point in time. But social loafing is this idea that we try less hard when we're in a group setting because we figure that somebody else will pick up the slack. So if I'm in a group of 5 or 6 people, I'm less accountable because there's 5 or 6 people to share that group work with. And so my contributions may seem minuscule or not as important. This especially happens if you've ever been in a group project and they say like, oh, everyone's going to get the same grade. Well, you know that someone's going to do the work, so why should you try so hard? And so basically that leads to this concept of social loafing. Someone will always put in the effort, and so you feel like you can reduce yours. In reality, though, what can happen is what's in this picture of these people here. One guy's catching a butterfly, someone else is sitting on the rope, the other 2 are joking around laughing. Then nobody tries as hard. And so we want to avoid that. So like teachers would be well advised to maybe not give the same grades for a group work. I do that, right? I don't assign the same grade. I assign group work, but I grade each student individually within the group. And so that hopefully diminishes the some of the effects here of social loafing or not trying so hard. All right, so social loafing, not doing your part or not trying as hard. Social facilitation, increasing the most likely response of your performance in front of a crowd. Now we move on to another group aspect, which is deindividuation. And so this is when you lose kind of yourself in a large crowd. You become less self-conscious and less restrained in a group, because if you're in a sea of 100 faces at like a rally or at an assembly, your face doesn't stick out, right? You don't feel like an individual anymore. You de-individuate, you lose your individualism, and you become a part of this larger crowd. And so this can happen, in like sporting events or riots, or lately we've seen a lot of like marches and rallies for different political topics. All of those kind of big crowds can help you like lose your identity. This can be sort of a dangerous situation, because if you feel anonymous or you feel like less inhibited by like who you are, you may be more susceptible then to acting out in like inappropriate ways. So one thing that I always find strange is, a lot of times after a team like wins the Super Bowl or wins a major sporting event, the people like go out into the town and they flip cars and light stuff on fire. And it's like, why are you rioting when you just won this big event? And part of that has to do with this idea of de-individuation. You're so hyped up and you're so, because of the sporting event, and then put you in a crowd of hundreds of other people, you may act out in ways that you normally wouldn't, because you don't feel like an individual responsible for your actions. You're part of the crowd and part of the group pushing yourself forward. Another example of this would be like people wearing hoods in the KKK. Like, you are kind of hiding your identity, and therefore you can act maybe in ways that you wouldn't act when your identity isn't hidden. Bank robbers who wear masks may be more aggressive and more violent, because again, they're hiding their identity and they're losing some of that individualism, if we instead could see who they were. So that is how de-individuation works. That's another kind of big concept with this unit. Ooh, good question, Catherine. Catherine said, can de-individuation be applied to the Stanford prison experiment? I think partially, yeah, like with the sunglasses and stuff, like how they wore, the prison guards wore those big, what are they called? Like aviator kind of classic 70s sunglasses. Yeah, because it kind of hides their identity, right? It kind of gives them almost a mask or a persona that they're putting on. I would say that it's not maybe the number one driving cause. We would definitely say role playing plays probably a bigger role in the Stanford prison experiment, but I definitely could see how putting on that sort of image or those sunglasses as kind of a mask could play a role in that. So that's a really good point. Good point, Catherine. Good. All right. So another group concept that we have to be careful of is group polarization. And so basically what happens with group polarization is that if I take all of my students who are Democrats and put them in one group, and I take all of my students who are Republicans and put them in another group, and let's say I have them discuss building a wall or something that's pretty politically divisive. All of my Democrat students are going to talk about their opinions about this, and then they're going to come back and they're going to feel even more strongly about their approach that building a wall is a bad thing and that we shouldn't do it. If I put all my Republican students together and have them discuss building the wall, they may all come back then and say, yeah, it is a really good idea to build this wall because X, Y, and Z. And so basically what happens is when we are in a group that shares our same beliefs and same attitudes, it actually strengthens our opinion, because you're like, well, all of these people agree with me. I must be right. This is the right thing to think. And so while we might like that, right, we might like to have people agreeing with us and validating our feelings, we have to be careful, because if we don't hear dissenting opinions, we may not actually consider all of the facts. I know, for example, I live in a fairly liberal area. I live in a college town outside of a college campus, and it just tends to be a really liberal area. And leading up to the 2016, the presidential election, the most recent one, I was like, oh yeah, there's no way President Trump is going to be elected. Everyone's going to vote for Hillary, because that's just what I heard in my community, right? It's a more liberal leaning town. And so this group polarization, this viewpoint of like, yeah, everyone's going to do this, everyone's going to vote for Hillary, this is the right thing, really was strong. And then it was really surprising when that didn't happen. And then you had to think, well, not everyone in my little insular area shares that belief. And so group polarization can be really misleading in some cases, because if we're only surrounding ourselves with like-minded opinions, we don't actually hear all sides to an issue, and we don't maybe think as critically about it as we should, which leads us then into groupthink. Groupthink is when we have harmonious but unrealistic thinking. So I know our textbook uses the Cuban Missile Crisis as an example. Basically, everyone was just agreeing with President Kennedy, which led the president to make some negative decisions. And so groupthink, another example might be the Larry Nassar USA gymnastics case. I don't know if you guys are super familiar with this, but this doctor abused a lot of young women on the gymnastics team. And how groupthink could play into this was that, the president of the universities knew about it. The president of USA Gymnastics had an inkling about it. But they all kind of agreed with each other, and there was no dissenting opinions to make people like question what they were doing, that maybe, oh, we could get in trouble for this, or we should do something about this. It led them to just kind of continue this harmonious thinking, even though it was really unrealistic to think that this wasn't a big deal or that someone wouldn't get in trouble for it. Sometimes we see groupthink maybe in marketing. I think like a year or two ago, there was this Kendall Jenner Pepsi commercial where there's people like protesting in the streets. I think it was supposed to be like an homage to like the Black Lives Matter marches. And Kendall Jenner like is doing a photo shoot, and then she walks out to these police officers who, like, if you know the history, right, there's some discontent there between protesters and the police and violence and things like that. And she hands this police officer a Pepsi, and then everyone's happy. And people just thought it was a little like tone deaf, right? That, a Jenner's just going to hand a cop a Pepsi, and all of this history of violence and disagreements and things are just going to go away. And so it's important, basically, the gist of this is that it's important to have people who are willing to disagree with you in a group setting. You don't want someone to just disagree to be a jerk, but you want someone who's willing to think through all sides of the issue. Because if we all are just like, yep, sounds good, we probably are not critically actually thinking about something and not weighing all of the options, which then can lead us to make catastrophic mistakes in some cases. So that is why we want to avoid groupthink. And so you can kind of see how like group polarization and groupthink work together in some cases. All right. So all of this group stuff can kind of be disheartening, right? Like, well, I'm just kind of just feels like we're just a cog in the machine, right? And I just go with the flow of the group. But my textbook emphasizes, and I want to emphasize, that there's also so much strength and so much power that we have as individuals. If you think about most inventions, the light bulb, electricity, cars, the telephone, all of these things typically started with like an individual, right? An idea. And that person had the perseverance to work on it, create it, market it, get people interested in it. And so I think that's really important to note as well. Yes, group dynamics are important, and we all fall for them, right? We conform, we follow the group, we do all of those things, but we also have great strength and great power as an individual. Social movements, think about like the Me Too movement that started with a couple of tweets from one or two people, and it becomes this huge awareness about harassment and assault and things like that for young women and young men. And again, that starts with one or two people. And so this idea of minority influence, this isn't a vocab word, but it's emphasized in some of the books. And basically, if you are someone who is kind of going against the crowd or going against the group, to have the most influence, you must maintain your controversial beliefs without faltering. So think about people like MLK, right? His beliefs like were quote unquote controversial to like a large number of the public at the time, right? A lot of white people were like, no, you're crazy. The civil rights movement is not happening or not a good thing. But he held strong to his beliefs. He never wavered. He preached the same message of peace and love and unity over and over and over again. And when you do that as an individual, you can start to sway the majority. If you don't falter, if you hold true to your beliefs, you'll start to convince other people, and pretty soon you're not in the minority anymore. More and more people are on your side. So yes, group dynamics are important, but we also have an important role to play as individuals in society as well. All right. Just a few things. I don't know if your guys' books, my book for the social psych section throws in some stuff about aggression and prejudice and stereotypes and stuff. I'm not going to talk a ton about the prejudice and stereotype stuff just because I just don't think I can do it justice in the like 5 to 10 minutes that we have here. I think it's really important, and I spend a whole bunch of time talking about it with my students. But I just don't think in like 5 or 10 minutes we can truly cover it. So I would just strongly encourage you guys to pay attention to those sections in your book and look at how prejudice and stereotypes and things like that can give rise, just partially because of how our brains function and partially how society functions, and kind of look at that biopsychosocial approach to things like that. So aggression is another thing that we try to like figure out, right? What causes one person to act out in super aggressive ways and another person in the same situation to act and respond calmly and reasonably? And so studies are trying to kind of get to the root of this, right? We talked a little bit about this in the bio unit, is can we pinpoint genes that are going to make people more susceptible to violence, to mental illness, to certain things? And if so, what are those biological factors? Well, what we know right now is that there are some genetic influences in regards to aggression. If we breed animals together or we look at identical twins, there are similarities to the levels of aggression. So we know that there's some sort of genetics at play. However, it's not that simple. There's not like one single gene that we can like pinpoint and say, oh, if this gene is turned on, this person will be aggressive. If this gene is turned off, they'll be calm and cool. It's typically like many genes. And so it's really impossible to like completely pinpoint or predict just based on genetic factors. We also know that certain parts of the brain facilitate aggression. For example, less activity in your prefrontal cortex can stimulate aggression. This, remember, your prefrontal cortex deals with planning and judgment. And so if you don't think things through and you don't weigh the situation at hand, you may be more susceptible to aggression because you just don't think it through, right? You react before you think. So that's something that's partially at play. Your amygdala, which deals with like fear, also plays a role in that. And there's other biochemical influences as well. Alcohol and drugs can play a role in aggression, hormone levels, things like that. Those are all biological factors. But just like anything in psychology, we can't just look at one aspect of it and have a complete answer. So instead, we have to look at like psychological and social factors as well. And so one kind of psychological / social, it kind of fits both of those factors, is this idea of the frustration aggression principle. And basically what this theory states is that if I have some sort of frustration, something that's blocking my goal, that's going to create anger, right? If I can't achieve my goal, I'm going to get angry. If I get angry, that can then generate aggression. And so the model that's pictured here, let's say that my goal is, what should my goal be? How about my goal is to make the basketball team at my school. Let's say then there's an obstacle to my goal, and that obstacle is that I am failing one of my classes. You can't play sports if you're failing a class. So my goal is to play basketball, The obstacle to my goal is that I can't play because I'm failing school. This leads me to frustration. And so that frustration can lead to aggression, which, let's say then I get angry and I yell at my social studies teacher because they're failing me and it's their fault that I'm not playing. That aggression arrow then is most likely going to lead to the punishment part, and then that's going to just further increase frustration. And so that's one thing that we in schools as teachers kind of are focusing on now, is trying to move away from this model of just strict kind of corporal type punishment, because what is it doing? According to this diagram, frustration leads to aggression, leads to punishment, leads to frustration, which leads to more aggression, which leads to more punishment, more frustration, more aggression. It's like a cycle, right? And we need to break that cycle. And so that's why schools are starting to do things like restorative justice and things like that, that don't focus so much on punitive measures, but instead focus on other measures that can lead a person to feel success. Sometimes aggression isn't always bad, right? Like, I think we think of aggression as bad, but aggression, like working really hard towards your goal furiously, can also lead to success, which then makes us feel better and reach catharsis. So aggression isn't necessarily always like violence. I think that's how we typically see that, but it can also just be like working hard towards your goal. And so this, I really like this chart because I think it can kind of model or show us kind of the frustration aggression principle in action. So this is a chart of the temperature in Houston, Texas on a day-to-day basis, and also the murder rate. And so we can see here that the murder rate increases a significant amount as the temperature increases, especially once we get into like the 80s and above. So what does this tell us? Well, there's probably some frustration that exists, right? And to me, I hate being hot and sweaty. Like, it drives me nuts. I can't stand it being sticky and humid and hot. It bothers me. So that's the frustration. And if you can't get past that frustration, like you don't have air conditioning or you have nowhere to go, that can lead to aggression, right? You're crabby, you're angry, you're on edge because you're uncomfortable and you don't feel well, which can then spill over into aggressive acts like murder, right? It doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, it's hot, you're going to murder someone, but there is some correlation there that we can hypothesize has to do with the more aggravated we are because of this frustrating thing, then the higher likelihood it is that we will commit a violent act. There's other reasons at play here too. If it's hot and sticky inside your house, you might go outside. If more people are outside, there's more interaction, which is also like more of a chance for there to be murders as well. So there's no causation there, right? Correlation does not equal causation, but we can examine the correlation of aggression and heat in different cities across the US. All right. And so this is just a chart then that takes some of those biological factors, some of those social factors, and some of those psychological factors and puts them all together into a chart that models for us the biopsychosocial approach to aggression. Excuse me. Other psychological examples would be things like rewards for aggressive behavior. So if you come from like a culture where it's deemed good to like be a man and prove yourself and things like that, you start to think that violence is a good thing or aggression is a proper way to like show who you are. Social cultural factors, things like being exposed to violent media, or parental models of aggression. If you have a parent who is physically aggressive, you would display those behaviors as well. So again, pinpointing why one person is aggressive in a situation and another is not simple. We have to really look at all of these factors together to understand behavior. All right, I just have a couple more new things and then we're going to do some review. We'll have a little shorter session tonight to kind of gear up for the next couple of weeks. So the bystander effect is another part of like decision making in a group sort of setting that we see happen sometimes, and it's kind of a negative thing. So the bystander effect basically says that if I'm in a group of people, I'm less likely to intervene in an emergency situation. And you can see the chart on the upper right hand there shows that when you are the only person present, you are likely to act or help somebody about 85% of the time. If it's you and another person present, your likelihood to respond drops to about 50-some%. Two people, you're in the 40s, so on and so forth. So the larger the crowd, the less likely you are to intervene or help in a case of emergency. Like if you're walking around a crowded mall and a person collapses on the floor, you're not that likely to intervene and help. And there's a few reasons why. And so this flow chart I have here that shows the decision-making process explains why as we get into larger crowds, we don't always act in the best interest of the person that needs our help. So first and foremost, you have to notice the incident. If I don't see the person collapsing in the middle of the mall, then I'm not going to help because I didn't see it. So that leads us to no helping. But if I notice it, we move to yes. Do I interpret this incident as an emergency? Like, do I think this person's like dying or needs help? If I think, nah, it's not an emergency, then I'm not going to help. I'm just going to keep shopping and go to Forever 21. If I do think it's an emergency, this is the final key, and this is really what gets at the bystander effect, is I have to assume responsibility. And it is very difficult for us to assume responsibility as an individual when we're in a crowd, because you think it's kind of like that social loafing idea. Well, someone else will do it. Someone else will take care of it. You don't feel individually responsible for intervening and offering assistance when there's 30 other people standing around. And so this can be problematic because if everybody is standing around thinking, well, someone else is going to help, then that person that's having a heart attack on the floor of the mall isn't going to get aid or get help. And so they actually teach you when you go through like emergency training to actually like designate people to help. So you have to like point at someone and say, you call 911, you help me move the body over here. And that way you're taking care of that last piece there, assuming responsibility. You're handing out responsibility to those different people. Therefore, then they are more likely to attempt to help in that situation because they've moved from like an anonymous bystander into someone, into someone who's been drawn into action and in from the crowd. So that's kind of how we avoid the bystander effect. And the one most famous case that really brings the bystander effect to our attention is the case of Kitty Genovese. I don't know if I've ever seen this on the AP test, but I know it's in my textbook and it does pop up on tests occasionally. So just to familiarize yourself with this example, Kitty was a young woman who was murdered on the steps of a large apartment building in Boston. So a big apartment, lots of different people lived there. It was during the day, I believe, or like in the evening. It wasn't super late at night. And several people, originally they claimed over 30, but some of that is disputed. But many people heard her cries. She was literally murdered on the front steps, and nobody intervened at the time. Eventually, while she was being attacked, a man like opened up his window and was like, hey, leave her alone. And then the attacker ran off. Kitty was injured pretty severely. She ended up stumbling into the back alleyway up onto the back steps of her apartment. And like still, nobody's helping her. And eventually what ends up happening is the attacker actually comes back like 10 or 15 minutes later, stabs her or beats her up some more. And then she ends up dying on the apartment steps. And so it's the middle of Boston, this high-rise apartment building. People definitely heard what was going on. And many people were like, well, I heard her yell, but I didn't think it was an emergency, or some people didn't want to get involved. And so it's really a perfect example of this idea of the bystander effect. Kitty probably would have been saved and would have been alive if just one person would have interpreted her situation as an emergency, would have assumed responsibility, and would have acted right away instead of leaving her there for like a half hour before the police showed up. So it's a pretty powerful example of the bystander effect in action. All right, the last part of then what we're going to talk about tonight focuses on how we view each other as enemies and how we can then work past our like ideas of each other in an enemy situation to cooperate and get along. And so the first thing that we need to talk about is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but basically it's when my belief in something, let's use for an example, I believe that Susie doesn't like me. That's my belief. Susie doesn't like me. And so this belief leads me to act in ways that confirm my beliefs. And then it just causes that belief to be further confirmed by that person's behavior. So let me explain. I believe that Susie doesn't like me. If I think that someone doesn't like me, I'm probably going to act towards Susie maybe a little cool, a little standoffish. I'm not going to be super warm and open to Susie because I believe she doesn't like me. So if I'm acting that way towards her, what is she going to think about me? She's like, oh, well, Megan's not very nice. She's acting kind of rude and kind of standoffish, and that's going to make Susie not like me, which just further then fulfills that prophecy that Susie doesn't like me, and then I'll continue to act that way. So it's like a cycle of beliefs and actions that just further confirm and further strengthen one another. And so this has to do with enemy perceptions, because if you think about in politics or like in international relationships, if we believe that this country is bad or evil, then we talk about and treat that country as they're bad and evil. So how are they then going to respond to us? In a negative way, which just further confirms our beliefs that they are bad and evil. And so it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy of that. And if you remember from the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment, I'm not sure if you have learned this in class, but this is a famous experiment where a teacher in the 1960s or 70s, I want to say 1960s, divided her class based on eye color. And she treated all of the blue-eyed kids very well. The blue-eyed kids were the preferred kids, and any brown-eyed kids were treated badly. They didn't get to go to lunch first. They didn't get to go to recess. She told those kids that they were stupid and not as smart, and blue-eyed kids are much better. And this was an experiment, and she just did it for like a day or two. But what ended up happening is that the brown-eyed kids, even within a matter of a day, started performing worse on their vocab, started performing worse on their math tests, things like that. Because this prophecy, this reinforcement of these ideas of being dumb and not worthy and stupid kind of made them feel that way about themselves, which then made them perform worse, which just furthered that belief system. And so this teacher, it's a famous experiment, you should look it up, it's really interesting if you haven't seen it, did this the next day. Then she flipped it. She gave the brown-eyed kids all of the privilege, and all of the blue-eyed kids were treated poorly. And even the kids themselves started to really like fight amongst themselves. They favored the same colored-eyed kids as each other. And it was really a powerful example of not only self-fulfilling prophecy, but how we like have bias towards people who are like us in certain situations. The other concept mentioned here is mirror image enemy perceptions. And basically, it's this idea that when we're in conflict with someone or another country, we tend to form the same diabolical images of one another. So in the Cold War, the Soviet Union might have described the United States as oppressive, crisis-ridden, imperialist, aggressive, predatory, anti-communist foreign policy. But if you asked the U.S. to describe the Soviet Union, we probably also would have said they're oppressive, they're crisis-ridden, they're imperialist, they're aggressive, they're predatory, they're anti-democracy foreign policy. And so the idea of mirror image enemy perceptions is that we tend to describe our enemies in terms that they would describe us as. We reflect like a mirror upon each other the same sort of negative beliefs back and forth. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward, I think. All right, so then how do we get along? How do we get past these negative perceptions and move towards cooperation? One way we do this is through superordinate goals. And basically, that's when two people or two sides come together to override any differences they have and work towards a common goal. So let's use an example, teachers and students. we'll say that we're opposing sides. Teachers are on one side, students are on the other. But the principle of the school says that if all students pass their semester exams, you get out of school a week early. That then creates a superordinate goal. It's a goal that both the teachers and the students want to work towards so that they reach that goal together. We may have different reasons for wanting to do that, but it requires our cooperation and working together. So two opposing sides together to work on this goal. So, the goal is to get out of school a week early. And there's a variety of ways that we can do this. It's called the 3 C's. There's cooperation, which is working together, right? Being open to one another. Communication, speaking, actually hearing one another out. You might have to, in some cases, not like in this scenario that I created, but you might need a third-party mediator to get the communication rolling, someone who has no vested interest in who wins the argument. And conciliation is important. Both sides have to be willing to compromise. You could call conciliation compromise as well. All right. And then the last strategy that you need to familiarize yourself with is called GRIT, which stands for Graduated and Reciprocated Initiatives and Tension Reduction, which is a mouthful. And basically, this is an international strategy that you will probably see play out in your lifetime many times between countries. For example, the U.S. and North Korea, we were negotiating about nuclear weapons, right? And so first, one side has to come out and say, I acknowledge that, let's say this is President Trump. President Trump would need to say, I acknowledge that North Korea and the United States have similar interests or mutual interests in coming to talks about nuclear weapons. And then the U.S., or whoever's talking, has to make a conciliatory act. So the U.S. might say, so in making a gesture of good faith, the U.S. is going to reduce sanctions on North Korea. So the U.S. comes out, we say we want to have a relationship with North Korea. We're going to do this thing to make this happen. Then North Korea, to finish this, to reciprocate, that's the reciprocate part in GRIT, would open their door and say, we also acknowledge that we would like to get along with the United States. So in turn, we are going to stop making nuclear weapons or reduce our sanctions that we have, something like that. So both sides come to the table, both give a little bit so that neither side looks like they're caving in. It's basically a strategy to allow both political sides to look like they're quote unquote winning. And so you'll see this a lot in international conflict and things like that play out. All right, moving on to some practice questions. There's the polls at the bottom of your page. There's just one question there. You can vote on the answer A, B, C, D, or E to each of the next 5 questions. It's anonymous, so take a guess if you don't know, just do the best you can. So the first question asks about Mr. Jones is a member of the faculty committee on academic standards at a local private school. He personally disagrees with the other committee members' proposed plan to accept students with below average grades. Mr. Jones is most likely, however, to vote in favor of the plan if, so this goes back to last time we were talking about what causes people to conform in certain situations. And so which of these scenarios would make Mr. Jones most likely to conform with the group, even though he doesn't personally agree with what they're saying? A, B, C, D, or E. Give you a few seconds to look it over and make your vote. Again, remember it's anonymous, so you might as well take a guess. You can just click and you can always change your vote too if you change your mind. All right, I'm seeing some votes coming in. Good. Yeah, the correct answer there is D. Other members are unanimous. If we remember, Ash did that line test, people were willing to say the wrong thing as long as the rest of the group was in agreement. So if everyone else is unanimous, it makes us really more likely to conform to what others are saying. All right, question 2. You can just vote right in the same poll. You just have to switch your answer. When no weapons of mass destruction were found following the invasion of Iraq, Some Americans revise their memories of the main rationale for going to war. The author suggests that we can best explain why people change their memories in terms of, which of these terms explains why we would change our thinking about the war in Iraq? Yeah, the answer here is cognitive dissonance theory. So cognitive dissonance talks about when our thoughts and our actions are opposing one another. They don't get along. So our thoughts are that there's weapons of mass destruction. Our actions, turns out there's not. So what are we going to do? Typically, we readjust our thoughts to match our actions. So then we say, well, actually, we went to Iraq to fight Saddam Hussein and terrorism. And so we change our thinking so that our actions match up. So that is good. Yeah. Cognitive dissonance. Question 3. Which of the following would be most consistent with a grit strategy? So we just talked about grit. Which of these scenarios do you think best shows grit in action? Looks like we're split on this one. The correct answer is actually going to be D. So I'm country A. I'm going to announce that I'm going to spend less money on defensive expenditures. And then I invite my enemy to do likewise, and they will then reciprocate and say, yes, we also will spend less money on defense expenditures. And so that is the reciprocation aspect of the grit strategy. Question 4. The fundamental attribution error is likely to be restrained by observing someone. Yeah, it looks like we're coming in with D in a variety of situations. Good. So the more that we observe somebody, the more we get to know somebody, the less likely we are to commit the fundamental attribution error. Because the more we know them, the more we see them, the more we say, well, this is actually because they're in, a negative situation, so I know that's why they're acting this way. Because normally they're a nice and kind and caring person. So it has to do with just knowing someone better. The better we know them, the less likely we are to commit the fundamental attribution error. And question 5. Which of the following comments is most likely to be made in a group characterized by groupthink? So if we all were experiencing groupthink, which of these things would we say? Yeah, looks like we're getting some good answers here. The answer is A. We're all in agreement. We don't need to continue this discussion. We're all good. And so we're just ending the discussion. We're not even going to consider thinking about all of the opposing viewpoints that might come out. And again, that's dangerous because it can lead us to make faulty decisions. All right, brief FRQ, and then we're done for the night. Alex volunteers during the summer as a lifeguard at the city pool. This summer, he has been promoted to the position of shift leader. One of the duties included with being shift leader is managing the 5 less experienced lifeguards that are assigned to the shift. Explain why Alex might need to be familiar with the following concepts from social psychology in order to minimize the impact they could have on the performance of the lifeguards. So, we have to take these terms, we have to define them, and then we have to apply them to the scenario. This is a pretty open-ended scenario, so you're going to have some free room here to kind of create your own scenario that goes with this. So first and foremost, bystander effect, we just talked about this, but you have to define bystander effect. So I start by, and I apologize for my poor typing here, but the bystander effect is a phenomenon that occurs when people fail to offer aid or assistance to someone, typically because the presence of others makes them feel like someone else will take care of it. So that's just straight up. You always just have to define it. I know we say this every time, but I just really want to stress that you define it as much as you can, and you try to avoid using bystander and things like that. So I would, instead of saying bystander, I say someone here. Now, why does Alex, the shift leader of his lifeguard company, need to be aware of and cautious of the bystander effect? So you would want to say something like, the bystander effect would be a very bad thing for lifeguards to have. Alex should be certain to encourage all lifeguards on duty to respond to a crisis situation in order to make sure that, how would I say this, the person experiencing the emergency is attended to. So basically, I'm saying that Alex needs to be aware of the fact that at times we might not respond to the emergency because of bystander effect. Therefore, he should require all of the lifeguards to respond. That way we can overcome this bystander effect in an emergency situation. So I'm explaining why he should be cautious or minimize then the bystander effect. So now I need to define social loafing. Social loafing is a phenomenon that occurs when working in groups. The larger, I can't type tonight. The larger the group, the less important we feel our contributions are. Therefore, we put in less effort. So now, how is Alex going to help his lifeguards avoid that? So let's look back at the question. Oops. Explain why Alex might need to be familiar with the following concepts to minimize their impact. So how can Alex minimize the impact of social loafing? To minimize the effects of social loafing, Alex could grade each lifeguard individually based on their performance, thus encouraging them all to put forth their best effort. So in order to minimize the effects of social loafing, Alex is not going to treat the lifeguards as a whole unit. Instead, he will treat them all as individuals and grade them as such. Therefore, he's minimizing the effects of the social loafing. So that is how I would briefly respond to each of those. I feel like both of those would score.